The sky over Ouagadougou was just beginning to blush with the first hints of dawn when President Ibrahim Traoré's eyes fluttered open. The presidential palace lay shrouded in silence, but within his heart, an inexplicable restlessness had taken root during the night. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, a gnawing sense that something fundamental was missing from his understanding of his own people. With careful, deliberate steps, he moved toward the tall windows of his chamber. The heavy curtains parted beneath his touch, revealing the city as it began to stir. Below, the streets were coming alive with the familiar rhythm of morning activity. People moved with purpose, their faces etched with the universal expressions of determination, fatigue, and hope that marked the beginning of another day's struggle. But as he watched, a troubling question echoed repeatedly in his mind. Do I truly know my people? Do I hear the genuine voice of their hearts, or merely the sanitized language of official reports? This question pierced his consciousness like a dagger, sharp and unavoidable. He knew that within the air-conditioned comfort of presidential chambers, surrounded by protocol and protected by security details, he had drifted far from the raw realities of ordinary citizens' lives. The marble floors beneath his feet, the mahogany furniture surrounding him, the respectful bows of his staff, all of it created a barrier between him and the truth he desperately needed to understand. Standing before his reflection in the ornate mirror, President Traoré saw a powerful leader, yes, but perhaps one who had become deaf to the silent screams of his people's struggles. The weight of this realization settled heavily upon his shoulders, and in that moment of clarity, a daring idea began to form. Why not venture among the people myself? Not as their president, but as one of them, without fanfare, without protocol, without the protective shield of office that separated him from reality? The decision crystallized with startling suddenness. Today, he would not be President Ibrahim Traoré. Today, he would be just another taxi driver navigating the streets of Ouagadougou, listening to every passenger's story, feeling every pain, understanding every hope and fear that coursed through the veins of his nation. Without informing his security detail or cabinet members, he moved to his wardrobe and selected the most ordinary clothes he could find. Faded khaki pants, a simple cotton shirt, a worn baseball cap, and dark sunglasses that would obscure his recognizable features. Looking at himself again, he was satisfied that no one would suspect this common-looking man was the president of Burkina Faso. The transformation was more than physical. As he changed clothes, he felt something shifting within his very identity. The presidential bearing began to melt away, replaced by the humble posture of a working man. He practiced walking differently, speaking in the informal dialect of the streets, adopting the gestures and mannerisms he had observed but never truly embodied. Moving silently through the palace's lesser-known corridors, he avoided the main thoroughfares where staff and security might recognize him despite his disguise. The back exit, rarely used except for discreet diplomatic meetings, provided the perfect escape route. No official car waited, no security detail flanked him, no flags announced his presence. For the first time in years, Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the streets of Ouagadougou as an ordinary citizen. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The very air felt different when breathed by a common man rather than a president. The sounds of the city, car horns, vendors' calls, children's laughter, reached his ears without being filtered through the respectful hush that usually surrounded him. Walking through the awakening neighborhood, President Traoré spotted an old yellow taxi parked near a small tea shop. The driver was nowhere to be seen, likely inside enjoying his morning refreshment and gossip with other early risers. The vehicle itself told a story of hard work and perseverance. Dented fenders that spoke of countless near misses in busy traffic, worn seat covers that had supported thousands of passengers, and paint faded by years of exposure to the harsh African sun. Taking advantage of the moment, he approached the taxi. The keys dangled from the ignition, a level of trust that spoke to the close-knit nature of the community. In his presidential life, such casual trust would have been impossible, a security nightmare. But here, it was simply the way neighbors treated each other. Sliding into the driver's seat, he felt the cracked leather beneath him and gripped the worn steering wheel. The engine coughed to life with a sound that spoke of mechanical loyalty despite advancing age. This old taxi would carry him into an adventure that would redefine his understanding of leadership. As he adjusted the rearview mirror, he caught sight of his own eyes, still recognizable to him but hopefully anonymous to others. Today, this weathered vehicle would become his chariot of discovery, carrying him not to diplomatic meetings or state functions, but into the honest conversations and unguarded moments that revealed a nation's soul. The sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the city as Ouagadougou fully awakened. Shop owners rolled up their metal shutters, revealing displays of goods that ranged from essential necessities to small luxuries. Motorcycles buzzed past like mechanical bees, their riders weaving through traffic with practiced skill. Public buses, overcrowded and exhaling black smoke, rumbled along their routes carrying workers to jobs that would barely pay enough to survive. In this bustling symphony of urban life, one more yellow taxi joining the flow would attract no attention. The president of Burkina Faso had successfully become invisible, camouflaged by the very ordinariness he had spent years being protected from. The first passenger appeared sooner than expected. A woman, bent under the weight of a large basket balanced expertly on her head, raised her hand in the universal signal for a taxi. Her posture spoke of years of carrying heavy loads, and her face bore the weathered dignity of someone who had never known an easy day. Ibrahim pulled to the curb, his hands slightly trembling with nervous energy. This was it, his first real test as an ordinary citizen. "To the Central Market," she said as she settled into the back seat with a weary sigh. "And please hurry. I'm already behind schedule." Her voice carried layers of meaning, exhaustion from rising before dawn, urgency born of economic necessity, and the quiet authority of someone who had learned to navigate life's challenges through sheer force of will. As Ibrahim put the car in gear and pulled into traffic, he found himself hanging on every word she spoke. The woman, perhaps finding comfort in the anonymity of speaking to a stranger, began to unburden herself. "My husband is sick again," she said, staring out the window at the passing city. "The children are still young, and without work it's impossible to make ends meet. Food prices climb every day like they're trying to reach the clouds, while the government sleeps in comfort. Who speaks for people like us?" Each word landed in Ibrahim's heart with the force of truth. These weren't the carefully worded concerns that reached him through official channels, filtered through layers of bureaucracy and political correctness. This was raw, unfiltered reality, the voice of a woman who measured her life not in policy achievements, but in meals provided and bills paid. She continued, her voice growing stronger as if the act of speaking lifted some invisible burden. "I wake up at 4 in the morning to prepare my goods. I carry this basket that weighs more than some grown men can lift. I stand in the market sun from dawn to dusk, smiling at customers even when my feet are screaming with pain. And for what? So my children can have one decent meal a day and maybe, if God wills it, stay in school long enough to have a better life than mine." Ibrahim felt moisture gathering in his eyes behind his dark sunglasses. In all his briefings about economic indicators and development statistics, he had never heard the human cost articulated with such stark clarity. This woman wasn't a number in a poverty report. She was the beating heart of his nation's struggle for survival and dignity. When they reached the bustling Central Market, Ibrahim pulled to a stop near the entrance where vendors were already setting up their stalls for the day. The woman reached into her worn purse, counting out coins with the careful precision of someone for whom every franc mattered. "No," Ibrahim said softly, gently placing his hand over hers to stop the transaction. "This ride is free today." She looked up at him with surprise, her eyes searching his face for some explanation for this unexpected kindness. After a moment, a tired smile crossed her features, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "There aren't many people like you left in this world," she said, gathering her basket and preparing to leave. "May God bless you and your family." As she disappeared into the crowd of early morning shoppers, Ibrahim sat in the taxi for several long moments, processing what had just occurred. This wasn't merely a taxi ride, it had been a revelation. A mirror reflecting truths that no presidential briefing had ever contained. The day was still young, and Ibrahim knew that each passenger would bring new insights into the lives of his people. He had barely pulled away from the market when a young man flagged him down. The student, for that's clearly what he was, judging by the worn textbooks protruding from his bag, climbed into the back seat with the careful energy of youth tempered by responsibility. "University, please," the young man said. "I have a final interview today for the medical program." As they navigated through the morning traffic, Ibrahim found himself genuinely curious about this passenger's story. "Medical school," he commented casually. "That's a noble pursuit." The young man's face lit up with passion, but quickly clouded with concern. "It's my dream to become a doctor," he said. "But education here is so expensive that even dreams become burdens. My father works construction and my mother takes in sewing to make ends meet. Still, for people like us, the future always feels uncertain." Ibrahim navigated around a pothole, one of hundreds that dotted the city streets like scars, while absorbing this information. Here was a young man with the intelligence and determination to heal others, yet the system made his path unnecessarily difficult. "If you were president," Ibrahim asked carefully, "what would you do differently?" The young man laughed, not bitterly, but with the kind of humor that comes from contemplating impossible scenarios. "First, I'd make education free for anyone willing to work for it. Second, I'd actually listen to the people. When those in power only travel by private jet, how can they smell the earth that regular people walk on?" The simplicity and wisdom of this response struck Ibrahim profoundly. From the mouth of a student came a critique more incisive than anything he'd heard in cabinet meetings. The young man continued, warming to his subject. "You know what the real problem is? The people making decisions about our lives have never lived our lives. They've never stood in line at a clinic for 6 hours hoping to see a doctor. They've never chosen between buying textbooks or buying food. They make policies about poverty while sitting in air-conditioned offices drinking imported water." Ibrahim nodded, making mental notes of every observation. When they reached the university gates, the imposing buildings seemed to loom over them like guardians of opportunity, magnificent but forbidding. As the young man gathered his belongings, Ibrahim made an impulsive decision. "Wait," he said, reaching into his pocket for some bills. "For your interview. Buy yourself a proper meal afterward, regardless of how it goes." The student's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. "Sir, Why would you—" "Because," Ibrahim said, removing his sunglasses briefly so the young man could see his eyes, "I believe in your dream. Don't let anyone convince you it's impossible." Walking toward the university entrance, the young man turned back once to wave, shouting, "Thank you! People like you give us hope!" Sitting alone in the taxi, Ibrahim felt a profound shift occurring within him. This wasn't just about gathering information anymore. It was about forming genuine connections with the people he served. Each passenger was teaching him something new about leadership, about responsibility, about the gap between intention and impact. The next passenger provided a different perspective entirely. An elderly man approached the taxi with careful steps, leaning heavily on a wooden cane carved with intricate patterns that suggested it was both functional and artistically meaningful. His white hair caught the morning sunlight, and his eyes held the depth that comes only from witnessing decades of change. He settled into the back seat with a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. For the first several minutes of the ride, he remained silent, content to watch the city pass by through windows that reflected both the present moment and memories of how these same streets had looked in decades past. Finally, as if deciding that this taxi driver could be trusted with his thoughts, he began to speak. "I have seen this country through war and peace, through hope and disappointment," he said in a voice that carried the authority of experience. "I fought for independence when I was young, believing that freedom would solve all our problems. Now I'm old enough to understand that independence was just the beginning of a much longer journey." Ibrahim drove carefully, giving the elderly man time to find his words while navigating the increasingly busy streets. "What do you think makes the difference between good leaders and poor ones?" he asked. The old man was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "A true leader," he said finally, "is one who eats last but listens first. Leadership isn't about giving orders from a comfortable office. It's about understanding the weight of responsibility that comes with power." These words resonated in Ibrahim's heart like a bell struck clearly in still air. Here was the fundamental truth that modern politics had forgotten: leadership as service rather than privilege, as burden rather than benefit. "I've watched presidents come and go," the old man continued. "Some were brilliant, some were corrupt, some were well-meaning but ineffective. But the ones who made real differences were those who never forgot that power is temporary, but the impact of your decisions echoes through generations." As they approached the old man's destination, a modest mosque, where he apparently attended daily prayers, Ibrahim felt compelled to ask one more question. "What advice would you give to a leader who wanted to truly serve his people?" The elderly passenger gathered his belongings slowly, but his answer came without hesitation. "Get out of the palace. Walk among the people not as their ruler, but as their servant. Listen to the woman selling vegetables who hasn't eaten lunch so her children can have dinner. Talk to the teacher working 2 jobs because education is undervalued. Sit with the elderly who built this nation and now struggle to afford medicine. Only then will you understand what leadership really means." As he prepared to exit the taxi, the old man turned back with a knowing look. "Young man, you ask questions like someone who cares about more than just earning fare money. Whatever path life takes you, remember that the foundation of any nation is its ordinary people living extraordinary lives of quiet courage." Ibrahim watched him walk slowly toward the mosque, his cane tapping rhythmically on the pavement. Another lesson absorbed, another layer of understanding, added to his growing comprehension of true leadership. The afternoon sun was climbing higher when Ibrahim spotted his next passenger, a thin woman accompanied by 3 small children whose faces were streaked with dust and perspiration. She waved desperately at the taxi, the urgency in her gesture suggesting this was more than a casual ride request. As the family crowded into the back seat, the woman immediately began explaining their situation with the rapid speech of someone accustomed to having very little time for explanations. "Please, to the bakery on Mohammed Feast Street. I need to buy bread, but I've been walking all morning and the children are tired." The oldest child, perhaps 7 years old, held the youngest on his lap while the middle child pressed against his mother's side. Despite their obvious fatigue, the children remained quiet, displaying a patience that children should never have to learn so young. "My husband lost his job 3 weeks ago," the woman explained as Ibrahim navigated through traffic. "He's been sick and the medical bills consumed our savings. The medications alone cost more than we used to spend on food for a week. Sometimes I wonder if this country only exists for the wealthy, and people like us are just tolerated as long as we stay invisible." Her voice carried no self-pity, only the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting observable reality. Ibrahim glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her stroking one child's hair with infinite tenderness while her eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond the car window. "But we manage," she continued, her voice strengthening. "I wake up before dawn to prepare food to sell by the roadside. The children help where they can. They're good children, better than I deserve. We don't ask for charity, just for the chance to work and provide for ourselves with dignity." One of the children spoke up suddenly. "Mama, will Papa get better soon?" The woman's composure wavered for just a moment before she regained control. "Yes, my heart. Papa will get better, and we'll have better days. We just have to keep believing and working hard." Ibrahim felt his hands tighten on the steering wheel. This family's struggle wasn't unique. It was replicated thousands of times across his nation. Families held together by the sheer force of maternal will and love that refused to surrender to despair. When they reached the bakery, Ibrahim made the same decision he had made with his earlier passengers. As the woman reached for her purse, he gently declined payment. "Please," he said softly, "keep your money for your family." The woman's eyes filled with tears of gratitude, but she maintained her dignity. "You're very kind, but we don't accept charity easily." "It's not charity," Ibrahim replied. It's one father helping another family. Sometimes we all need a little help. The children, sensing something special about this moment, began waving enthusiastically as their mother led them toward the bakery. The youngest called out, "Thank you, Uncle. You're very nice." Sitting in the taxi afterward, Ibrahim realized he had learned something profound about resilience. This woman faced challenges that would overwhelm many people, yet she maintained her hope, her dignity, and her love. She was not a victim but a warrior, fighting daily battles for her family's survival and future. As the day progressed, Ibrahim found himself at a taxi stand where several drivers gathered to share stories, smoke cigarettes, and wait for passengers. He positioned his vehicle slightly apart from the group to avoid too much interaction that might reveal his unfamiliarity with taxi culture. Soon, a group of 5 young men approached, their energy and animated conversation immediately filling the car with youthful vitality. They wore the casual clothes of university students, but carried themselves with the confident swagger of youth untempered by harsh realities. "Driver," one of them said as they settled into their seats, "take us to the youth center. And don't spare the gas. We've got places to be." As Ibrahim began driving, the young men launched into an enthusiastic critique of everything they saw wrong with their country. Their conversation was peppered with slang and pop culture references, but underneath the casual tone lay serious concerns about their future. "This government is useless," declared one passenger. "All promises, no action. If I ever met the president face to face, I'd tell him exactly what I think about his policies." Ibrahim found himself curious. "And what would you tell him?" "I'd say, come down from your ivory tower and live like us for a week. No security detail, no official cars, no special treatment. Let him ride public transportation, eat at cheap restaurants, apply for jobs that don't exist, and then see if his policies make sense." Another young man joined in. "The problem is that politicians live in a different world. They make decisions about our lives without understanding our reality. They talk about job creation while their own children get jobs through connections. They speak about educational reform while sending their kids to expensive private schools abroad." A third voice added, "What we need is someone who remembers what it's like to struggle, someone who's actually lived through what ordinary people face every day." Ibrahim listened intently, recognizing that beneath their criticism lay genuine patriotism and hope. These young people weren't apathetic. They were passionate about their country, but frustrated by systems that seemed designed to exclude them from meaningful participation. "You know what would be revolutionary?" asked the first speaker. "A leader who actually kept his promises, who showed up without fanfare to real places where real people live and work, who made decisions based on what people need, not on what looks good in newspapers." As they reached their destination, one of the young men turned to Ibrahim with curiosity. "You ask good questions, driver. You should be in politics yourself." Ibrahim smiled. "Maybe politics should be more like taxi driving, listening to people, taking them where they need to go, and making sure they arrive safely." The group laughed at this observation, but as they exited the car, one of them said, "That's actually profound, man. If politicians thought like that, we'd have a much better country." Watching them walk away, Ibrahim reflected on the energy and idealism of youth. These young people weren't asking for special treatment. They wanted opportunity, fairness, and leaders who understood their struggles and aspirations. The next passenger provided yet another perspective on the challenges facing ordinary citizens. A middle-aged woman approached the taxi carrying a worn leather satchel and an expression of quiet determination. Her clothes were neat but showed signs of careful maintenance, and her posture suggested someone accustomed to standing for long hours. "To Nazinon Primary School?" "Please," she said as she settled into the back seat. "I'm running late for my afternoon classes." As they drove through the city center, Ibrahim noticed her organizing papers and checking lesson plans despite the bumpy ride. Her dedication was evident in every movement. "Long day?" Ibrahim asked conversationally. The woman smiled with the patience that comes from years of working with children. "Every day is long when you're trying to educate the future of the country with inadequate resources. But it's also rewarding in ways that can't be measured in money." She gestured toward a stack of handmade teaching materials visible in her bag. I make my own visual aids because the school can't afford proper supplies. Some of my students don't have textbooks, others come to school hungry, and a few arrive without shoes. But they're eager to learn, and that makes everything worthwhile. Ibrahim was struck by her matter-of-fact acceptance of challenging conditions. It must be frustrating to work without proper support. Frustrating, yes, but not discouraging, she replied. Every child who learns to read despite our limitations is a victory. Every student who graduates and goes on to secondary school represents hope for their family and community. We teachers may not have much, but we have the power to change lives one student at a time. As they approached the school, Ibrahim could see children playing in a dusty courtyard under the shade of a few scraggly trees. The building itself was modest, its paint faded and walls showing signs of needed repairs, but the sound of children's laughter and learning echoed from open windows. You know, the teacher continued as she prepared to exit, what we need most isn't just money, though that would help. We need recognition that education is the foundation of everything else. A country that doesn't invest properly in its teachers and schools is a country that has given up on its future. When Ibrahim refused payment for the ride, the teacher looked at him with curiosity. You speak like someone who understands the importance of education. Have you worked in schools yourself? In a way, Ibrahim replied carefully. I've been learning a lot about education lately. From teachers like you. As she walked toward the school entrance, several children ran to greet her with enthusiastic hugs and rapid-fire reports about their day. Ibrahim watched this scene through his side mirror, deeply moved by the obvious affection between teacher and students. The afternoon was advancing when a well-dressed man in a business suit hailed the taxi from outside a bank. His expensive clothes and confident manner marked him as someone from the business community, providing Ibrahim with an opportunity to understand concerns from a different economic perspective. To the Chamber of Commerce building, the man said crisply, immediately pulling out his phone to make calls. His conversation was conducted in the rapid, urgent tone of someone dealing with multiple time-sensitive issues. No, the shipment is still delayed at customs, Ibrahim heard him saying. The paperwork requirements change every month and nobody can explain why. Yes, I understand we need regulations, but this is ridiculous. How can we compete internationally when basic business processes take 3 times longer than they should? When the call ended, the businessman sat back with obvious frustration. Ibrahim decided to engage him in conversation. Business troubles? Ibrahim asked sympathetically. The man sighed deeply. Every entrepreneur in this country faces the same challenges. We want to create jobs to contribute to economic growth, but the system seems designed to make business as difficult as possible. Endless paperwork, unclear regulations, officials who don't understand how commerce actually works. He stared out the window at the passing street scene. I employ 15 people and I'd like to hire more. But between the regulatory burden, unreliable infrastructure, and lack of access to reasonable credit, it's a constant struggle just to keep the doors open. Ibrahim navigated around another pothole, noting how the businessman winced at the rough ride. What would make the biggest difference for businesses like yours? Simplified procedures, reliable electricity, decent roads, and officials who see businesses as partners in development rather than sources of revenue to be squeezed, the man replied without hesitation. We don't want special treatment, just fair treatment and the basic infrastructure needed to succeed. As they approached the Chamber of Commerce, Ibrahim realized this businessman's concerns were interconnected with everything else he had heard that day. Poor infrastructure affected not just individual families but economic development. Bureaucratic inefficiency hurt not only government services but private sector growth. You're an interesting taxi driver, the businessman commented as he prepared to pay. You ask thoughtful questions. If more government officials thought like you, we'd have a much more business-friendly environment. Ibrahim accepted this comment with a humble nod, adding another piece to his growing understanding of the challenges facing his nation from multiple angles. As afternoon melted into evening, Ibrahim continued his journey through the lives of ordinary citizens. Each passenger brought new insights, new perspectives, and new understanding of the complex realities facing Burkina Faso. A young couple climbed into the taxi, their whispered conversation revealing dreams and anxieties about their upcoming marriage. They worried about finding affordable housing, about building a stable life together in an uncertain economy, about bringing children into a world that seemed to offer them limited opportunities. An elderly woman selling mangoes spoke of the dignity of honest work despite its meager returns, of grandchildren she was helping to support, of the small satisfactions that made difficult days bearable. A nurse heading to her night shift described the challenges of providing health care with insufficient supplies, of watching patients suffer because medications were too expensive, of finding joy and purpose in healing despite systemic limitations. Each story added layers to Ibrahim's understanding, painting a complex picture of a nation filled with hard-working, hopeful people who faced daily challenges with remarkable resilience and grace. As evening shadows grew longer, Ibrahim's most intense experience as a taxi driver began when a desperate man ran toward his car, flagging him down with urgent gestures. "My child!" The man gasped as he threw open the car door. "She can't breathe! Hospital, please, as fast as you can!" A woman climbed in, carrying a small girl who appeared semi-conscious, her breathing labored and irregular. The child's mother was crying softly, trying to stay calm while fighting obvious panic. Ibrahim immediately understood that this was a life-or-death situation. Without hesitation, he pushed the accelerator to the floor, navigating through traffic with skill and urgency while constantly reassuring the terrified parents. "Stay strong," he told them, making eye contact in the rearview mirror. "We'll get there in time. Your daughter is going to be okay." The journey to the hospital took only minutes, but each second felt eternal. Ibrahim's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity as he maneuvered around slower vehicles, ran red lights safely, and used his horn to clear a path through busy intersections. At the hospital emergency entrance, medical staff immediately took charge of the situation. Within minutes, the child was receiving treatment. Her breathing began to improve, and her parents' desperate fears transformed into grateful relief. The father returned to the taxi to thank Ibrahim, tears streaming down his face. "You saved my daughter's life," he said, grasping Ibrahim's hands. "I don't know how to repay you for this kindness." Ibrahim was deeply moved by this experience. In this moment, he wasn't a president or a policymaker. He was simply a human being helping another family in crisis. The power to help directly, immediately, and meaningfully was something he had rarely experienced in his official role. As darkness settled over Ouagadougou, Ibrahim continued driving, now experiencing his city from the perspective of night workers, people whose labor kept society functioning while others slept. A security guard carrying his meal and a thin mattress climbed into the taxi, heading to his overnight post. During the ride, he spoke about missing his children's bedtimes, about working multiple jobs to support his family, about the sacrifice of present moments for future possibilities. "I see my children only when they're sleeping," he explained with quiet sadness. "I leave before they wake up and return after they're in bed. Sometimes I wonder if I'm disappearing from their lives, but what choice do I have? They need food, school fees, a roof over their heads." This conversation struck Ibrahim profoundly. Here was a man sacrificing his most precious resource, time with his children, simply to provide for their basic needs. The government Ibrahim led should be creating conditions where such extreme sacrifices weren't necessary for ordinary families to survive. Near midnight, Ibrahim finally began his journey back to the presidential palace. He was no longer the same man who had left that morning. The day had transformed his understanding of leadership, of responsibility, and of the profound trust placed in him by millions of citizens. Returning the borrowed taxi to its original location, he walked through the darkened streets to the palace's rear entrance. The guards, though surprised by his informal appearance and late-night return, immediately recognized their president despite his disguise. Back in his chambers, Ibrahim changed clothes and stood once again before the mirror. The face looking back at him was the same, but everything else had changed. Behind his eyes now lay the voices, faces, and stories of real people whose lives were affected by every decision he made as president. The next morning, President Ibrahim Traoré called an emergency meeting with his senior staff and cabinet members. When he entered the conference room, they immediately sensed something different about their leader. A new intensity, a deeper seriousness, a transformed perspective on their shared responsibilities. "Yesterday," he began without preamble, "I learned more about our country than I have in all my previous briefings combined. I spent the day listening to our citizens speak freely about their lives, their struggles, their hopes, and their disappointments. What I heard demands immediate action." He spoke with passionate conviction about the woman carrying heavy baskets to market, the student whose dreams were threatened by educational costs, the elderly man's wisdom about servant leadership, the mother's strength in supporting her family, the teacher's dedication despite inadequate resources, the businessman's frustration with bureaucratic obstacles, and the security guard's sacrifice of family time for survival wages. "From today forward," he declared, "every policy decision will be evaluated through the lens of how it affects real people living real lives. We are not rulers, we are servants. We are not separate from our people. We are accountable to them." The changes began immediately but quietly. President Traoré understood that real transformation required action, not publicity. The market with the leaking roof, where women sold their goods with determination and humor, was quickly repaired, equipped with proper facilities and solar lighting. The school where the dedicated teacher created her own materials despite inadequate resources received new supplies, proper lighting, and additional funding for teacher support. A small field was converted into a proper football pitch for the children who had dreamed of having a place to play and nurture their aspirations. Healthcare workers like the nurse he had met received improved working conditions, better equipment, and recognition for their dedication under difficult circumstances. Business registration processes were streamlined, reducing bureaucratic obstacles for entrepreneurs trying to create jobs and contribute to economic growth. These improvements were implemented without fanfare, without political speeches, without claims of credit. President Traoré had learned that genuine change was measured not by announcements, but by improved lives. Within weeks, people throughout the country began noticing subtle but significant improvements in their daily lives. Social media buzzed with speculation about whether their president had somehow become more connected to ordinary citizens' needs. Some people remembered the unusual taxi driver who had shown them kindness and asked thoughtful questions. A few began to wonder if there had been something special about that encounter. But President Traoré never confirmed or denied these speculations. For him, that day remained not a political strategy, but a sacred experience. A reminder that true leadership required not just authority, but empathy, not just power, but understanding, not just decisions, but connection with those affected by those decisions. Months later, the effects of that single day continued to ripple through Burkina Faso's government and society. Policy discussions now routinely included consideration of how proposals would affect ordinary citizens. Government officials were encouraged to engage directly with the communities they served. The president instituted regular listening tours, where he visited communities without protocol or fanfare, simply sitting with people and hearing their concerns firsthand. These sessions became legendary for their authenticity and effectiveness in connecting leadership with lived experience. International observers noted improvements in Burkina Faso's governance indicators, but more importantly, citizens reported increased trust in their government and greater hope for their country's future. President Traoré often reflected on the lessons learned during his day as a taxi driver. He had discovered that effective leadership required more than policy expertise or political skill. It demanded humility, empathy, and genuine connection with the people being served. The experience had taught him that the distance between rulers and citizens could be measured not just in physical space, but in understanding, compassion, and shared experience. The most important qualification for leadership wasn't educational achievement or political connections. It was the ability to see the world through the eyes of those whose lives hung in the balance of governmental decisions. Years later, When historians wrote about President Ibrahim Traoré's administration, they would note the remarkable transformation that occurred not through grand gestures or political maneuvering, but through a single day when a leader chose to listen rather than speak, to serve rather than rule, to understand rather than assume. The story of the president who became a taxi driver spread throughout West Africa and beyond, inspiring other leaders to seek authentic connections with their citizens. Some dismissed it as a publicity stunt, but those who knew Ibrahim Traoré understood that it represented something much deeper, a fundamental reimagining of what leadership could and should be. The changes initiated by that transformative day continued to expand throughout Burkina Faso society. The market women who had once struggled with inadequate facilities became small business entrepreneurs, their increased prosperity lifting entire neighborhoods. The student who had shared his dreams in the taxi eventually became a doctor, establishing a clinic in one of the country's underserved regions. The teacher whose dedication had moved the president so deeply became part of a national education reform committee, bringing classroom reality to policy discussions. Her handmade teaching materials evolved into a standardized resource program that helped educators throughout the country provide quality instruction. Despite limited budgets, the businessman who had complained about bureaucratic obstacles found himself appointed to a commission tasked with streamlining government procedures for entrepreneurs. His practical experience proved invaluable in creating systems that actually worked for people trying to build businesses and create jobs. Even the security guard who had spoken about missing his children's bedtimes benefited from new labor policies that provided better wages and more reasonable working conditions for night shift workers. His sacrifice had not gone unnoticed, and systemic changes ensured that future generations of workers wouldn't face such stark choices between family time and financial survival. Perhaps most significantly, the president's taxi driving experience catalyzed a broader cultural shift in how government operated. Cabinet meetings began to include regular citizen perspective discussions, where officials were required to consider how their decisions would affect ordinary people going about their daily lives. Government departments established regular community engagement programs, not the formal town halls that had previously served as mere political theater, but genuine listening sessions where citizens could speak freely about their experiences and needs. These sessions became so valued that they expanded from monthly to weekly occurrences in many regions. Civil servants were encouraged to spend time in the communities they served, learning firsthand about the challenges and opportunities their policies were meant to address. This practice initially met with resistance from some bureaucrats comfortable with office-bound routines, eventually became a source of professional pride and effectiveness. The presidential palace itself underwent symbolic changes. The imposing gates that had once separated the seat of power from the people were opened more frequently. Garden areas were converted into spaces where citizens could meet with government officials in informal settings that encouraged honest conversation rather than ceremonial presentations. The international community took notice of Burkina Faso's evolving approach to governance. Development organizations that had previously struggled to implement effective programs in the country found new levels of cooperation and insight from government, partners who truly understood local conditions. Foreign diplomats reported that meetings with President Traoré had acquired a different quality. Discussions were grounded in practical realities rather than abstract theories, and policy proposals were evaluated through the lens of citizen impact rather than political convenience. At international conferences, President Traoré became known for asking probing questions about how global initiatives would affect ordinary people in member countries. His interventions often redirected high-level policy discussions toward more concrete and meaningful outcomes. Other African leaders began privately asking him about his methods, curious about how he maintained such strong popular support while implementing sometimes difficult but necessary reforms. His answer was always the same. Listen to your people not as subjects to be managed, but as teachers who can help you understand your job. On a personal level, President Traoré continued to process the profound impact of his taxi driving experience. The day had revealed not just information about his country's challenges, but fundamental truths about the nature of leadership and service. He established a personal practice of regular, anonymous interactions with citizens, sometimes as a customer in local markets, occasionally as a passenger on public transportation, frequently as an unannounced visitor to schools, clinics, and businesses. These experiences kept him grounded in the reality of ordinary life and prevented the isolation that often accompanies high office. His family noticed changes in him as well. Dinnertime conversations increasingly focused on the stories of people he had met and the lessons he was learning about effective governance. His children grew up understanding that their father's job was not about privilege or prestige, but about service and responsibility. The president's wife became an informal partner in his listening initiatives, often accompanying him on community visits and developing her own networks of citizen engagement. Together, they modeled a different kind of political leadership, one based on humility, accessibility, and genuine care for the welfare of all citizens. Not every aspect of this transformation was smooth or universally welcomed. Some political opponents criticized the president's informal approach as unprofessional or populist. Traditional diplomatic protocols were sometimes strained by his insistence on authentic rather than ceremonial interactions. Certain members of the political and business elite felt uncomfortable with leaders who possessed intimate knowledge of ordinary citizens' lives and concerns. Some preferred the previous system where policy discussions could remain abstract and theoretical rather than grounded in human impact. Security. Concerns arose as the president's informal interactions with citizens became more frequent and less predictable. The security detail had to develop new approaches that balanced legitimate safety concerns with the president's commitment to remaining accessible to the people he served. International partners occasionally expressed confusion about protocol when dealing with a leader who might arrive at meetings with fresh stories from taxi rides or market conversations, rather than traditional briefing papers prepared by staff members. These challenges led to innovative solutions that further transformed governance practices. Security protocols were redesigned to enable safe but authentic citizen interactions. Rather than creating barriers between the president and the people, security became a facilitator of genuine engagement. Government communication strategies evolved from traditional top-down messaging to multi-directional conversations. Citizens' stories and perspectives became integral parts of policy announcements, helping the broader population understand how decisions were made and why they mattered. Parliamentary procedures were modified to include regular citizen voice sessions, where ordinary people could address lawmakers directly about the real-world impact of proposed legislation. These sessions, initially viewed skeptically by some politicians, became highly valued for their ability to improve policy effectiveness. Training programs were developed for government officials at all levels, teaching them how to engage authentically with citizens and incorporate grassroots perspectives into their work. These programs became models for public administration education throughout the region. The governance transformation had measurable economic effects. Foreign investment increased as international businesses recognized the stability and effectiveness that came from government policies grounded in reality rather than theory. Domestic entrepreneurship flourished as bureaucratic obstacles were reduced and support systems improved. The agricultural sector, which employed the majority of Burkina Faso's population, benefited from policies developed through direct consultation with farmers rather than academic theories about rural development. Crop yields increased and farm incomes improved as government support aligned with actual needs rather than perceived problems. Small businesses proliferated as registration processes were simplified and access to credit improved. The market women who had once struggled with basic infrastructure became successful entrepreneurs, creating employment and contributing to economic growth throughout their communities. Education investments, guided by insights from teachers and students rather than distant administrators, produced measurable improvements in literacy rates and school completion statistics. The country's human capital development accelerated as educational policies addressed real barriers to learning. Healthcare outcomes improved as policies were shaped by input from medical professionals working in actual treatment conditions rather than theoretical models. Maternal mortality rates decreased, vaccination coverage increased, and access to basic medical care expanded significantly. Beyond economic indicators, Burkina Faso experienced a profound social transformation. Citizens reported increased trust in government institutions, greater sense of civic engagement, and stronger belief in the possibility of positive change through democratic participation. Community organizations flourished as people felt their voices were genuinely valued by government leaders. Volunteerism increased as citizens became partners in addressing local challenges rather than passive recipients of government services. Intergenerational dialogue improved as young people saw their perspectives reflected in government policies, and older citizens felt their experience and wisdom were respected and utilized. The social fabric strengthened as different demographic groups found common ground and shared conversations about national development. Gender equality advanced as women's voices, long marginalized in formal political processes, became central to policy discussions. The market women, teachers, nurses, and mothers who had shared their stories with the taxi-driving president saw their concerns translated into concrete policy improvements. Religious and ethnic harmony improved as government policies were developed through inclusive processes that respected diverse perspectives while focusing on shared human needs and aspirations. President Traoré's taxi driving experience became a case study in leadership education programs throughout Africa and beyond. Business schools, public administration programs, and leadership development institutes used the story to illustrate principles of authentic leadership and citizen-centered governance. The experience challenged traditional notions of executive, authority, and professional distance, demonstrating that effective leadership often required vulnerability, curiosity, and willingness to learn from those being served. Students of governance learned that power used wisely meant power shared through genuine dialogue and mutual understanding. International development organizations began incorporating similar immersive experiences into their training programs, recognizing that theoretical knowledge about poverty, governance, and social challenges needed to be grounded in actual experience with the communities being served. The story inspired similar experiments in other countries, as leaders sought ways to bridge the gap between policy-making and lived experience. While not every attempt was successful, the principle of authentic citizen engagement became a recognized best practice in democratic governance. On a deeper level, President Traoré's experience contributed to evolving philosophical discussions about the nature of democratic leadership in the 21st century. Political theorists began exploring concepts of embedded leadership and empathetic governance as alternatives to traditional models of executive authority. The experience demonstrated that effective leadership in complex societies required not just intelligence, vision, and political skill, but also emotional intelligence, cultural competence, and genuine care for citizen welfare. These qualities, long considered secondary to technical expertise, gained recognition as essential leadership capabilities. Academic discussions about democratic accountability expanded beyond formal mechanisms like elections and legislative oversight to include ongoing authentic engagement between leaders and citizens. The taxi driving experience illustrated how such engagement could produce better policies and stronger democratic institutions. The story challenged assumptions about professional distance and executive authority, suggesting that leaders who maintained artificial separation from those they served were actually less effective than those who sought genuine understanding of citizen experiences and perspectives. The story of President Traoré's transformation spread far beyond Burkina Faso, inspiring leaders and citizens worldwide to reconsider the relationship between government and governed. Translation into dozens of languages allowed the story to reach audiences across continents, each finding relevance to their own political and social contexts. In established democracies dealing with citizen disengagement and political polarization, the story offered a model for rebuilding trust through authentic leadership and genuine listening. Politicians in various countries began experimenting with their own versions of direct citizen engagement, though few achieved the transformative impact of the original experience. Developing nations facing challenges similar to those in Burkina Faso found practical guidance in the story's demonstration of how leadership change could catalyze broader social and economic improvements. The specific policies mattered less than the underlying principle of grounding governance in citizen reality rather than abstract theory. International organizations working on governance and development issues incorporated the story's lessons into their programming, recognizing that sustainable change required not just resources and technical expertise, but also authentic understanding of local conditions and perspectives. Ultimately, the story of President Ibrahim Traoré's day as a taxi driver transcended its specific context to become a timeless parable about leadership, service, and the relationship between power and responsibility. The yellow taxi that carried him through the streets of Ouagadougou became a symbol of leadership transformation, ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in impact. The passengers he encountered represented more than individual citizens with specific problems. They embodied the collective wisdom, resilience, and hope of ordinary people everywhere who deserve leaders capable of understanding their lives and serving their needs effectively. The transformation that began with one leader's decision to listen rather than speak, to learn rather than assume, to serve rather than rule, demonstrated that authentic change is always possible when those in positions of authority remember that their power exists not for personal benefit but for the welfare of all citizens. In classrooms where future leaders study governance, in communities where citizens organize for change, in government offices where policies are crafted, the story continues to inspire and instruct. It reminds us that the most profound political transformations often begin not with grand speeches or elaborate programs, but with simple acts of human connection and genuine efforts to understand the experiences of those whose lives hang in the balance of our decisions. The yellow taxi returned to its regular service, carrying ordinary passengers on routine journeys through the streets of Ouagadougou. But the extraordinary day it spent carrying a president through his transformation into a true servant leader continues to echo through history, reminding us all that authentic leadership is always within reach for those humble enough to listen, brave enough to learn, and committed enough to serve.